Christianity is not an African religion. Christianity is not a religion that wasn't forced on the overwhelming majority of people of African descent. But if you listen to some of the people like this young lady and some of these esoteric Christians who are trying to hold on to this religion because they want to make it black, because they can't let it go, because they've been indoctrinated into it, then you're going to believe the nonsense that these people go out here and they're teaching. But today I'm going to demonstrate how everything that she says in her statement about about Christianity going into Africa before it went into Europe, about King Azana of the Axiom Empire in 330 having Christianity in Africa before it was in Europe, and that it wasn't forced on the people of African descent who live in America nor the people in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to demonstrate that to you. But first, I want you to listen to a word from the sponsor of this video. So this Monday, Bruce will be on my live. So make sure you follow me at Coach Renz 33 on YouTube and Facebook so you can interact with the author, pick his brain a little bit, find out more about his journey from leaving the church and how he detoxified himself to be able to restructure and rebuild himself and to still lead a moral spiritual life without the toxicities of Christianity. And in this video, I look forward to helping you with that. So, the big claim that many Black people love to make is that Christianity was in Africa before it was in Europe. First, they will say that it was in Africa, meaning that it went to Egypt before it went to Europe. Well, this is flat out untrue if you are a believer in the Bible and if you just study history. But from the Bible's own perspective, Paul supposedly wrote his letters between around 54 CE and 69 CE. These letters went to these churches, the churches of Ephesians, the Corinthian church, the church in Rome. They went to these different churches that was, yes, in the Turkish Anatolia, but also in Europe. Italy is part of Europe. Can't just look at Britain, France, Spain. Italy is part of Europe. Greece is part of Europe. So these teachings of Christianity, according to the Apostle Paul, entered into Europe prior to entering into Egypt. Now, some who believe in the church tradition of the Coptic Church will say that Mark, the Apostle Mark, who was born in modern-day Libya, that he brought Christianity into Egypt. But if you go by the exact same tradition, then what you will learn is that before Mark went to Alexandria, Egypt, and started the Coptic Church there, he first traveled with Paul in Rome, Ephesians, Colossians. So he first traveled throughout Europe and Anatolia and the Levant with Paul before he retired into Alexandria, Egypt, before he was supposedly slain. Now, there is absolutely no data whatsoever that would demonstrate that at the time frame, Mark went into Egypt. This is all based on church tradition. This is based on church historians such as Eusebius and Origen. This is not based on anything that you can lay your hands on that is archaeological proof to demonstrate that that's what Mark did. But we do know that at least by 106 CE, that the fifth pope, according to church tradition, the fifth pope came out of Alexandria, Egypt. We do know that by 106 CE, there was a Coptic church in Egypt. So Christianity entered Africa at the earliest in and around 69, 70 CE, if you follow the biblical understanding of it, the biblical tale of it all. If you believe that Paul existed, if you believe that Jesus existed, then that would be your mindset. But does history demonstrate that? Well, what history does demonstrate is that throughout the Roman Empire, that there were Christians in the late first century. That after 70 AD, we have absolutely zero information other than propagandist historians like Tacitus, who purposely wrote that Nero was burning Christians in Rome when the fire of Rome happened. Now, even though we know Tacitus is a propagandist for the Piso-Flavian family and was backdating history in order to make the Julio-Claudians look bad, there is actually zero information or archaeology that demonstrate that Nero burned any Christians. But Christians like to believe that. And if Christians were to believe that, then Christians would have to say Christianity was in Europe before it was in Africa. You see how your conversation will unravel if you try to follow the idea that Christianity was in Africa. Well, if that's the case, you have to say that Tacitus was a liar, that Nero didn't burn Christians to light the city streets in Rome. You would have to take that information away. You would have to then also take away the fact that Paul started a church in Rome, started a church in Colossus, started a church in Galatia. Those were in European areas and in areas of Turkey. That all of those churches could not have been, because that would predate Mark going to Alexandria, Egypt, and starting the church in Africa. So therefore, Christianity was in Europe first. Now, what history actually teaches us is that sometime in the late first century, there started to crop up this idea of Christianity after Titus returned triumphantly back to Rome. On the Ark of Titus, there is absolutely zero information that would lead you to think that Christians existed during his time frame. He demonstrates how he conquered the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, the people of Judea. He did not demonstrate any conquering of any Christians, any sects of Christianity. In the annals of Titus, he does not mention Christians or Christians of the sort. None of them. Even in Josephus's work, you don't hear about Christians. You hear about high priest named Yeshua, who had a brother named James, but he doesn't fit the category of your Jesus because of his parentage and that fact that he was a high priest as well, and the part that he played with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It doesn't fit. Another Yeshua doesn't fit. The one who was called into question by a Roman governor, but is not Pontius Pilate. It doesn't fit. But he does not mention about Christians, because we know that the Testimonium Flavianus was added to his work after 400 CE. But back to the question, back to the statement, Christianity entering. Yes, if you can say that Christianity entered Africa, roughly a decade maybe after it had already entered into the Roman Empire of the European parts. But that's Egypt. The overwhelming majority of Black people on this planet, families originate in sub-Saharan Africa. Can you demonstrate where European colonization took slaves from Egypt and brought them to the Americas, took slaves from Egypt and brought them to the Caribbean? That is absolutely not where slaves originated from in the Americas. So if your family history has been in the Americas from the time frame of American slavery, they did not come from Egypt. And don't worry, I'll get to the Hebrew of it all. Now, the other thing that they like to talk about is that the Ethiopian the country that is now known as Ethiopia, at that time frame, the Axiom Empire, that King Azana declared Christianity to be the state religion, the national religion of the Axiom Empire. This is the empire that would later become Ethiopia. This happened in 330. And they will point to how this happened in 330 in Ethiopia. The colonization of Africa did not begin until the 1400s, the late 1400s. So therefore, Christianity was an African religion before it was the colonizers brought it into West Africa. It sounds good for someone who's never studied it. It sounds good for someone who doesn't critically think about what's being said here. Sure, King Azana forced Ethiopians to become Christian in 330. He did not ask. It wasn't something that was evangelized. It was something that this king forced on his people. So that's one, it was still forced on the people of Ethiopia. Two, this happened in 330, not because he felt the power of God, but King Azana, who wanted more relationships with Rome, better trade relationship with Rome, the Roman Empire, seeing that Christianity had just been shown some favoritism by Constantine, decided that he would flip over to Christianity. Now, how did this happen? Because people want to make a difference between what becomes the Christianity of the Roman Empire and what becomes the Christianity of Ethiopia. Well, a little prior to 330, a gentleman named Frumentius, who was a priest in the church in Alexandria, the Coptic Church of Alexandria, shipwrecked on the land of Axiom. After being shipwrecked and captured, he is let loose to return to Alexandria, but then asked the bishop of Alexandria of that time frame, which more than likely would have been Athanasius, if he could return back and evangelize to the Axiom people. In his return, he evangelizes, talks to, teaches Coptic Christianity to King Azana. Now, you would think that that would be something very different from the Roman style of Christianity. Well, at this time frame, there wasn't a canon. And although Athanasius was very much in favor of the books that are in the New Testament now, since every year from 325, he was publishing that these should be the books that are canonized. Those books plus other writings were brought by Frumentius to King Azana. And because of those books, then they was like, look, we're going to add in the books of Enoch, which was a very popular book in Egypt, especially with the Gnostics. We're going to add in all these other books, these books of Jasher. We're going to take all the books that we can get our hands on. So the more popular books in the Coptic areas of Egypt and the Gnostic areas of Egypt were added to this canon. Not so much with the Gnostic, but more of the Coptic writings were added. And so Ethiopia was able to canonize their own Bible because they were not under Roman rule. Had they been under Roman rule, they would have canonized the same Bible. But many of their teachings are in perfect alignment with the teachings of the Roman Church because they were taught by someone who was in line with the Roman Church. So there is no great difference. And when people say that the Ethiopian Bible is the oldest Bible, we have a 15th century copy of the Ethiopian Bible. We have no idea if that 15th century copy, that the Ge'ez that it is written in, is the same as what was written in 330. We have absolutely no idea, because there is no copy of any Ethiopian Bible that is dated back to 330 or 360 or 400 or 500. So you cannot claim that it is the most accurate. It is the oldest, and it's not the oldest. We have other lexicons that are older than that, whether we're talking about the Septuagint, Vaticanus. There are other codexes that are older than the Ethiopian Bible. You're just talking about something that's in a completed state, and that is all. But the Septuagint is a completed state of the Old Testament. The Valentinus is a completed state of Old Testament and New Testament. They're older, so you do not have the oldest Bible. And what would it matter? If the information is true or false, that's all that matters. Now, I want you to think about something for a second. How many slave ships that came to the Americas, came to the Caribbean, that came from Ethiopia? How many missionaries came from Ethiopia into sub-Saharan Africa? How many missionaries came from Egypt into sub-Saharan Africa between the time frame of 300 to the early 1500s? How many? Who said? That's how many. When the colonizing Spanish and Portuguese were given instruction by Pope Nicholas V to go into West Africa and to subjugate the people, enslave the people, and to Christianize the people, they experienced people who had never heard of Christianity or anything similar to Christianity. As other colonization began to occur, the people had only heard of Christianity if they had heard from one of the other colonized areas, colonized countries. But no one from Ethiopia and no one from Egypt was going into sub-Saharan Africa teaching Christianity. Christianity did not spread into those areas. As a matter of fact, from 600, Egypt became Islamic and only had a resurgence after the Ottoman Empire was destroyed or defeated. But it became Islamic. There was no Christian Egyptians in 700 and 800 and 900 going into Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. There were Muslims crossing the Sahara Desert, enslaving, capturing, beating and murdering, forcing people into Islam. But there were no Christians coming out of Egypt doing that. There were no Ethiopians swinging around the face of Africa and coming up to the west coast of Africa and enslaving people, or teaching Christianity, I should say, teaching Christianity. So no, Christianity came to Europe prior to it ever going to Africa. Christianity that went to Egypt is very similar to the same Christianity of Rome. That Egyptian Christianity is the Christianity that taught the Ethiopians. That version of Christianity was not established until 330, and they never went into sub-Saharan Africa to teach anyone anything. So this mindset, and the gentleman who's sponsoring this video, Bruce, his book goes into greater details of the psychological warfare that has been played on people and still being played today. There was at no time frame did we have Christianity in our ancestry if your ancestry comes from West Africa, until the slave ships came, until the colonizers came. Now, for the Hebrew Israelite of it all, only if you believe in the idea that three people had enough genetic diversity. Well, 6 people had enough genetic diversity to be able to create every human being on the planet after the flood without us being uh, having mental issues and physical issues. The cell degradation that would have occurred if only 6 people were repopulating the earth. Scientifically, we know that that does not happen. And as far as the idea of the pristine nature of the earth, you have absolutely zero evidence to back that up. There are different time frames that the earth was vile, filled with methane. Rivers did not flow pretty when you have people washing animals upstream, throwing their human waste upstream. You have no evidence concerning the health of the earth. Now, you can get that evidence by looking at core samples, and we can tell how much methane was in the air, how much carbon dioxide was in the air, how much nitrogen was in the air. Was there any other pollutants in the air? And we can see that that goes up and down, up and down, up and down. So there was no pristine era that we just moved into this nasty era. Think about the fact that volcanoes have erupted and have been erupting. Some are not erupting now, but used to erupt 2,000, 3,000 years ago, casting all kinds of ash clouds in the sky, poisoning the waters and the lakes and the rivers. There are meteorite craters that would throw up dust clouds, poisoning the air, poisoning the river. So there is no pristine time frame. So the Hebrew Israelite would believe that we all stem from these 3 sons, and that most of the black people are either children of Ham or children of Shem. If you disagree with their message, then you're a Hamite. If you agree with their message, then you a Shemite. They believe that they are from these 12 tribes of Israel. These 12 tribes of Israel that supposedly were scattered. And when they scattered, these 10 tribes that were supposedly lost. Well, when was the 10 tribes lost? Consider this, if you will. The time frame that the story of Joshua supposedly being written would have happened in around the 1200 BCE, 1100 BCE. Those 12 tribes then began to be conquered around 700 BC by the Assyrians. The Assyrians absorbed those northern tribes into their empire, the overwhelming majority of the northern tribes into their empire, which was 10 of the tribes. They're not lost. They became Assyrians. And then the Babylonians conquered and reconquered and then absorbed them into their society. They became Assyrian Babylonians. They're not lost. But the question is this: there were people already in sub-Saharan Africa long before 1200 BCE. There were Egyptians long before that. As a matter of fact, consider this, if you will, Hebrew Israelitisms. Your story of Noah would have happened around 2700 BCE. And according to your story of Noah, Ham's children, one of them is Mizraim. Mizraim is Egypt, the people of Egypt. This is what y'all say. And then y'all say Cush, that the people down in Cush, they were the Cushites. Right? These are the people of Egypt, Africa. But why is it that we see that the Egyptians were already a well-defined, well-built civilization prior to 2700 BCE? That we see that they had dynasties that goes back to the 3000 and 4000 BCE. How could they be the children of the children of Ham? How could they be Mizraim if they were already established at the time frame of the flood, during the flood, and maintained themselves after the flood? It was not a Tower of Babel that separated them. No, they were already in their lands. There were already people in Mesoamerica. There were already people in Asia and China. There were already people in Europe. There were already people all over the world. We are not Israelites. And then the transatlantic slave trade pulled from West Africa. They were not Israelites either. They worshiped their river gods and ocean gods, and they had their supreme deity of Olorun, if you're talking about this one tribe. But different tribe, Chechua was a supreme deity of another tribe. Different tribes have different worships of different gods. So we know we are not Hebrew Israelites. But it is this type of mental manipulation and historical massaging that has caused people to think that they can renegotiate the text of the Bible to fit some Afrocentric ideas of God's true children and whom God has actually blessed. When it is so far from the truth, it is still part of your indoctrination. You're living the life of inception. You think you've escaped from the dream, but you're still part of the dream. It's time to wake up. So you'll find the link to the gentleman's book, to Bruce's book in the bio, not in the bio, in the description of this video. Support this book if you're going through this time frame where you're deconstructing or you're detoxifying or you're restructuring. Then it's a book that you should add to your library. And always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.